Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Bienvenidos a esta conferencia de nuestro invitado internacional de este año, que es la crítica y curadora Isabelle Graw. Tenemos la alegría de contar con su conferencia hoy, donde nos hablará de sus investigaciones respecto de cuestiones vinculadas al mercado del arte y a la noción de valor dentro de lo que es el funcionamiento del sistema del arte. Isabel es una persona que muy leída en nuestra escena artística, muy leída por también muchos de los que componemos el Departamento de Arte de la Universidad di Tella, porque sus investigaciones respecto de la idea de valor y sus miradas sobre el mercado del arte, de alguna manera piensan al sistema de generación de valor como parte del sistema de generación de sentido de las obras de arte y como un aspecto interno y no accesorio a la práctica artística. Isabelle Graw vive y trabaja como crítica de arte en Berlín, es profesora de Historia del Arte y Teoría de Arte en el Stadtschule y fundó junto con Daniel Birnbaum el Instituto para Críticos de Arte en el 2003, que se enfoca en prácticas de crítica y sus múltiples relaciones con otras disciplinas. Junto con Stefan Gerner fundó la revista Texte zur Kunst en Colonia en 1990. En el 2018, Isabelle Graw publica The Love of Painting, Genealogy of a Success Medium. Otras publicaciones incluyen High Price, El arte entre el mercado y la cultura de la celebridad, esa traducción es mía, Pensando a través de la pintura, reflexividad y agencia más allá de la tela, y Übermalerei, que significaría algo así como la gran pintura o la pintura superior. En diciembre de 2018, Isabelle Graw recibió la beca Opus Magnum de la Fundación Volkswagen, que le permite abocarse a su investigación respecto de la idea de valor de arte con total dedicación. En español, podemos mencionar que la editorial Mansalva ha publicado un libro muy interesante titulado ¿Cuánto vale el arte? Le damos por favor la bienvenida a Isabel, si podés abrir tu cámara y tu micrófono. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Quería mencionar, antes de que comience Isabel con su conferencia, que por favor escriban sus preguntas en el chat. Esas preguntas van a ser recopiladas y tendremos la hora final de nuestra conferencia para leer esas preguntas e interactuar con nuestra invitada.
Thank you, Carlos, for having invited me. I'm very sorry I can't be in Buenos Aires in person, which I would have loved to be. And also thank you, Sol, for organizing everything, for Marina, for the translation. It's very exciting to have a simultaneous translation. This is a first in my history of giving lectures. I want to apologize in advance also for my somewhat German-sounding English. And I also want to say something about the images that I'm going to show, which won't do justice to the artworks. They sometimes function as illustrations, and sometimes I'll speak more in depth about the works, but just that you know what's going on when you see these pictures. So I'm going to kind of show my PowerPoint now. Is this working, Carlos? Can you see it? Great.
Perfect. Perfecto, sí.
So, as you already mentioned, Carlos, the title of this talk is The Value of Art Under Different Conditions, Outline of a Research Project. And when I say outline of a research project, this means that this is a work in progress and that I look forward to discuss it with you. It's not the last word on value. It's just an attempt to develop a value theory of art and to do justice to the changed conditions that we have been confronted with in the last years. So basically the lecture consists of two parts. In part one, I will try to present the broad lines of my value theory, and you will see that in methodological terms, my presentation will combine theoretical propositions and case studies. These go hand in hand. So this means that my attempt toward a kind of more general theoretization of art's specific value form always relates to specific artistic practices. In the second part, I will address the changes that occur in a global pandemic, changes that affect the value of art as well. Because due to the pandemic, as you all know, social struggles, above all Black Lives Matter, have intensified worldwide. And in view of these protest movements like Black Lives Matter and also Me Too, I will end my talk by investigating how the gendering or the racialization of artworks affects their value form. So the talk will have 16 steps. I will announce each of the step. This was the introduction, and now I'm starting with step 1, which is concepts of value and value form. And let me also look at my watch because I don't want to be too long. My plan is to talk about 1 hour, and then I would like us to have a discussion. So let me start by explaining what I mean by value and also what I mean by value form. Value, in my understanding of it, does not refer to the monetary value of artworks. And this is quite important. When I say value, I don't refer to the often noted auction records and high prices of the last years in the art market sphere. And this has been an upswing that seemed to have come to a sudden halt when the global pandemic started in March 2020. However, the price of an artwork is not synonymous with its value, in my perspective. On the contrary, price is a manifestation of value, as Moishe Postone aptly put it. It thus expresses value in the categories of money, but it is not value itself. In my understanding of it, value rather designates what Karl Marx termed commodity value. Commodity value is a value that presupposes commodities. According to Marx, commodity value relates to human labor while abstracting from human labor. And due to value's thoroughly abstract nature, it needs an objective expression, which usually takes the form of money. By claiming a value form for artworks, I want to suggest that artworks can, like money, be the site where value gets expressed. 2. Artworks as commodities of a special kind. According to Marx, and I already hinted to this, the value of ordinary commodities results from an obscuring of the concrete labor that has been expended for them. Value, in Marx, is thus the site where concrete labor gets abstracted from, where concrete labor gets, if you wish, eclipsed. Compared to this Marxian value that results from abstract labor, the value of artworks is similar and different at the same time. Because on the one hand, it is quite hard, if not impossible, to grasp the authentic artistic labor that has been expended for an artwork. Consider Sarah Morris's colorful grid paintings in large formats, which foreground their product and commodity-like qualities. Their extraordinarily glossy and saturated surfaces seem utterly impregnable, an opaque coating that recalls the outer skin of luxury goods, such as jewelry boxes or sport cars. Similar to the commodity fetish, the specific labor that was expended on making these painterly surfaces vanishes from view when contemplating them. These surfaces instead function as a kind of mirror of value in which generalized human labor emerges only as a quality that seems inherent to them. But while some artworks, like Sarah Morris's, resemble Marx's commodity fetish in that they obscure artistic labor, they still remain, and this is my central argument, artworks still remain commodities of a special kind. Why is that? Why are artworks commodities of a special kind? I think they are commodities of a special kind because, in contrast to ordinary commodities, artworks are able to suggest that their value is substantial, irrespective of whether they obscure their labor conditions, which happens also in Jeff Koons' balloon dog that you see here, or whether they try to symbolically render their conditions of production transparent, which is something Fontana's slashing into his canvases kind of try to do. Whether they obscure their labor, or whether artistic labor gets seemingly rendered transparent, artworks always produce the sensation that the artistic labor that has been expended for them rests somewhat inside them. They are thus able to produce the sensation of being valuable as such. But now you might ask, what is it that allows for this sensation that their value is inherent to them? I trace the artwork's potential for such a substantialist suggestion back to three factors. One, to the fact that artworks are material one-offs, they are unique. Two, I trace this back to the specific symbolic intervention that artworks are said to make. And three, to the specificity of artistic labor and the privileges still attached to artistic labor. In the course of this lecture, I will demonstrate how it is these three factors put together that allow for the artwork's ability to suggest that its value has been caused by it. Artworks will be shown to provide a material, substantial, and an ideal symbolic basis to value, a basis that their value, while being abstract and social through and through, can be attached to. 3. Methods and premises on value reflection. I would like to note in advance that I consider art histories and art criticism's theoretical propositions as being essential for the process of value creation. These narrations play a central role, not least because of how they have driven forward the process of value creation historically, if only by claiming meaningfulness or relevance for certain artworks. I will thus keep in mind my own participation in the process of value creation in the following, all the more so considering that I will declare certain artistic practices to be value reflexive, which is a way of increasing their symbolic value. The basic thesis of this lecture is that the value of artworks is constituted differently than the value of ordinary goods. I want to explore this assumption by looking at a small selection of artistic practices since the post-war period that I consider to be value reflexive. Works like Piero Manzoni's Merda d'Artista from '61, which you see here, or more recently Annette Kelm's Camouflage from a photograph from 2019. These works are value reflexive, in my opinion, because they refer at times more and at times less explicitly to their own value form. I thus presuppose value to be something that artistic production can actually reflect upon. Now, you might rightly wonder, how on earth can artworks actually reflect upon themselves? How would they reflect on their value if value is something that they are also defined by? The notion of a value-reflexive artwork seems even more problematic, considering that artworks are not reflecting subjects. Unlike subjects, they cannot reflect on their values independently. But what artworks can do, in my mind, is present value-reflexive images, illusions, or statements, provided that there is a viewer or interpreter who is willing to decipher them. I therefore don't understand value reflection as an objective quality to be found in artworks. Rather, I consider value reflection to be an epistemological potential that can be occasionally detected in artworks or claimed for some of them. Value as interplay between artistic production and reception. From an art historical point of view, I furthermore want to argue that the value of an artwork results from an interplay between both production aesthetical and reception aesthetical factors. I thus neither privilege artistic production and artistic labor as the site of value generation, which is what Marxist historians tend to do, nor do I solely put the emphasis on the value attributing activities of the viewers or consumers, which is the usual approach from sociology, from Georg Simmel to Boltanski is square. What I do is combine the two, combine the production aesthetical and reception aesthetical perspective. On the side of production, I consider, for one, the material, unique character of artworks, two, the way an artwork is said to symbolically intervene into its respective context, and three, the residual specificity of artistic labor as contributing to art's specific value form. In addition to these specificities of artistic production, I trace art's specific value back to a collective, affective, mimetic, receptive desire that the French economist André Orléans termed l'affect commun, English common emotion. When transposed onto the conditions of the art world, Orléans' common emotion could be understood as a collective, affective, mimetic desire that aims at some artworks and thus considers them valuable while ignoring all others. It is thus a desire that equally leads to value attribution, then it leads to value discriminations. No value without fictional expectations. Now, what is it that either pushes this collective, affective, mimetic desire, this common emotion forward, or holds it back? The direction this desire takes depends, structurally speaking, on those fictional expectations and imaginary futures that get triggered by an object. And the term fictional expectation is one that I borrow from the German sociologist Jens Beckert. Once an artwork sparks fictional expectations, the desire for it will intensify. So whether the artwork will be enriched with value or whether it won't be considered valuable depends on the recipient's projections about its future's worth and credibility. Now, these fictional expectations are of course not equally distributed. And this is something, funnily enough, the female soccer player Megan Rapinoe recently pointed out in a very different context, in the context of female soccer. At one point in her autobiography, she describes how male players are paid for what they could do in the future. In other words, their payment depends on the future expectations associated with them. Female players, by contrast, have always to prove themselves, according to Rapinoe. They are paid for what they have already done, she notes. And even if they outperform expectations, they are still asked, well, are you going to do it again? This lack of trust in the female soccer player's future worth is something female or Black artists also experience. For someone or something to be considered worth our investment in them, a constellation of trust has to emerge, a constellation of trust that often fails to materialize, historically speaking, in the case of female or Black artists. This trust that needs to emerge around an artwork for it to be considered valuable often fails to materialize in their case. It is a trust that reflects institutional value systems, as Linda Nochlin already pointed out. Value judgments are an echo of a deeply enrooted systematic racism and sexism. I will come back to this in the second part of the talk. The belief in art's intrinsic value. I've already hinted to this. Artworks have the potential to suggest that their value has substance. Their value thus appears to be substantial. This belief in art's substantial or intrinsic value is widespread in the art world and quite present in the auction sphere in particular. Consider the statements of former auctioneer Tobias Meyer in this respect, who often claimed an intrinsic value for artworks in his promotional speeches online. Such a claim stands in total contrast to what Karl Marx notes right at the beginning of Capital, where he points to intrinsic value being a contradiction in itself. For Marx, the value of a commodity is thus nothing that can ever be inherent to it. Marx understood value quite on the contrary as a social relationship, as something that is thus relational and not substantial. But at the same time, Marx insisted on values, albeit abstract, relation to labor. According to Marx, value is an objectification, in German a Vergegenständlichung, of human labor. It thus represents labor, and by representing it, it abstracts from it. For me, I must say that this is the strong point of Marx's labor value theory, that it manages to retain both value's abstract social nature and its relation to concrete human labor. Simply put, Marx characterizes the value of an ordinary commodity as covering up or eclipsing its conditions of production. Artworks, by contrast, and this is what I argue, artworks are able to nourish the opposite impression, that they carry their own conditions of production within themselves, as when they show visible traces of the artistic labor that has been expended for them. Such traces of labor are not only naturally to be found in many artworks, such traces of labor are also often produced quite deliberately, for example, in some of the mechanically produced silk-screened works by Andy Warhol, one of which you see here. They show traces of labor that were added afterwards, such as applied hand-painted areas that were applied on the silk screen. It is often those artists who opted for mechanical procedures, from Warhol to Wade Guyton. It's those artists who make sure that seemingly authentic traces of labor remain still detectable in their works. Such strategically produced traces of labor could be termed value reflexive, insofar as they deliver that which is crucial for value in art, artistic labor, and render it seemingly present in the work. Material one-of-a-kinds, uniqueness as value generation. Now I come to this first conditions that makes artworks be commodities of a special kind, which is the fact that they are material one-offs. I already hinted to this. The artwork's specific commodity value needs to be attributed to the fact that it usually circulates as a material unique product. Artworks are perceived as unparalleled and irreplaceable one-of-a-kinds because, in contrast to ordinary goods, they go back to a singular author. And this is even true for multiple artist editions. They are no exception from this rule because the status of uniqueness gets approached here by limiting the editions. The artwork's uniqueness furthermore derives from the fact that it is seen as the product of a singular author, an author who's not to be found elsewhere, an author who exists in her own singular way only once. And it is the artwork's signature that certifies it originating in singular authorship. Here we have an example for an artist who put a lot of emphasis on his signature, Markus Lüpertz. From a value theoretical point of view, the signature is a crucial device because it binds the artwork and its author closely and visibly together. Now, you might rightly wonder, what about all those artistic procedures that have emerged since the 1960s, which aimed at precisely undermining authorship, for instance, when opting for working in a collective? Haven't such collective practices managed to question and displace authorship quite effectively? I would answer to this that it is quite the contrary that happened. Author-critical procedures, such as the collective, don't weaken but actually strengthen authorship. Authorship gets more potential here, if only due to the fact that the collective has a name. In this case, it's General Idea and Fischli and Weiss. The collective has a name and consists of several people. Collectives like General Idea, Fischli and Weiss, Wiener Spaldings, to name but a few, don't subvert authorship because they function like a powerful meta-subject or surplus author. And this surplus author has the further advantage that it subsumes more lives than one under it. 8. Materiality and ephemeral materials in value production. Next to the artwork's uniqueness, it is its material dimension that also serves as a kind of concrete support or hook, I would say, for its value form. Artworks are usually perceived directly as something material. I would suggest that we consider the special case of immaterial NFTs later in the discussion. The fact that a material dimension is usually needed for value formation also applies for so-called dematerialized or conceptual artistic practices such as performances. Despite their ephemeral character, conceptual and performative practices have developed a wide range of procedures, relics, certificates of photographic and filmic documentation that ensure the existence of a material hook or device that allows value to attach itself to it. In the case of Arne Imhoff, it's paintings, drawings, and objects that function as relics as well because they were in touch with the live performance. This equally applies to those artworks from the 60s. Think of, here's just one example for another kind of immaterial practice that leaves something material, which is a certificate in this case, which is Yves Klein. But I now want to come to artworks from the 60s, like Joseph Beuys' Corner of Greece or Dieter Roth's chocolate works. These are works that aim at the evaporation or dissolution of matter. Matter gets transformed and pushed to its limits in these works. Now, while such works certainly pose a challenge to museum conservators who have to render them durable, they also contribute to an expanded notion of material and materiality. Materiality now encompasses decaying or evaporating materials as well. They too are allowed to get integrated into an ever-expanding value sphere. Once we consider artworks as material practices or as immaterial practices that leave material traces behind, this gives us a better grasp of their specific value form. Because due to their material dimension, their value is one that seems to have been caused or triggered by something. We are thus dealing with a form of value that allows for the sensation that this value somewhat resides inside the artworks. However, for this sensation to emerge, we need a viewer who's willing to perceive in this way, a viewer who's ready to project this fantasy onto artworks. A fantasy, I might add, that is not only materially caused, but also gets induced by the artwork's symbolic accomplishments. So we are dealing with a fantasy here that results from a projection while not being totally unfounded. I'm now coming to the kind of relationship, the tense relationship between symbolic and market value, and we will look at Annette Kelm's work more closely in order to do that. I think I have alluded to this already. The symbolic accomplishments made by artworks or claimed for them also contribute to their specific value form. It is important to note that a structural shift has taken place in this respect since the second half of the 19th century. Pierre Bourdieu has demonstrated this for the literary milieu in Paris. He demonstrated how symbolic value was mainly negotiated among the artists themselves at the time and their colleagues, writers and critics. A writer who received symbolic value was highly regarded by his peers, whereas his market success rendered him rather suspicious in the late 19th century. I have shown elsewhere in my book High Price how things have evolved and changed since. At least since the 1990s, symbolic value has been increasingly decided upon by the actors of the secondary market. And in such a context, it is often market success that functions as a yardstick of symbolic worth. In the auction sphere in particular, symbolic meaning is often falsely equated or confused with price. Annette Kelm's camouflage work seems to revolve around this tense relationship between symbolic and market value in the current economy. I would argue that this picture of a plant, with its juicy and rampant leaves, stands emblematically for modern art's claim since the 18th century. Its claim that it follows its own rules and grows on its own terms. Its autonomous growing thus demonstrates how it develops in a self-determined fashion, as if invoking the old ideal of art's autonomy and self-determination from 18th century's idealist aesthetics, an ideal that was already at the time a partly fictive one. Because in actual fact, artistic autonomy turned out to be rather a relative autonomy, to use Bourdieu's term, and this was already due to those external economic constraints that reached deeply into the artistic field and marked its practices. One could even go one step further from Bourdieu's assumption of the artistic field as relative autonomous by arguing for a view that rather considers it as increasingly heteronomous. Indeed, the market zone has expanded in the last 20 years by entering into the last spheres of society. This triumphant advance of the market zone seems to be signaled by Kelm's banknotes, which decorate the plant like a Christmas tree. One can thus interpret these banknotes as stand-ins for a market value that increasingly determines and shapes the artwork's symbolic value. Now we come to the person in the product. This is fun now, I hope. Kind of more entertaining, hopefully, even more entertaining. Because I'm now looking at a kind of different artistic reflection of art-specific value form, which is Pier Manzoni's already mentioned famous work, Merda d'Artista, from '61. It is a work that consists of 90 cans that are supposedly containing the artist's feces, the artist's shit. These cans present themselves like a commodity, written label included. They were supposed to be sold for the daily value of 1 ounce of gold. By explicitly orienting itself to the price of gold, it is the difference between artwork and monetary investment that gets symbolically narrowed down in this work. By making its monetary value depend on gold, Manzoni's cans furthermore hint to the structural similarities between art and money before 1973, the year the Bretton Woods system ended. Until then, money had been backed up by gold, which is not unsimilar to how the worth of an artwork gets backed up by its material dimension and by its symbolic accomplishment, I might add. As an aside, I think that there is a historical correlation to be detected between the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1973 and the rise of contemporary art as a speculative investment good, a rise that could be said to be emblematically represented by the great commercial success of the so-called skull auction that also happened in 1973. Once money wasn't guaranteed anymore by gold, by something material, art could step in and play the role of a currency that is secured by its appearance as something unique, material, and symbolically meaningful. Back to Manzoni. The content of each of his cans furthermore points to art's privilege to convert valueless, abject materials, such as shit, into gold, respectively, into money. The cans also carry to extremes the already mentioned strong bind between the unique product and its singular author. Because Manzoni seems to have entered this work in the form of his naturally conserved feces. He's literally to be found in the cans, as if stuck in them. One could say that this work triggers the sensation of an intrinsically valuable artwork, while reminding us how such a sensation is both illusionary and not without reason. This is because value is declared to be something that is inherent to this work, but at the same time, it is nothing, this value is nothing one could ever get a hold of, because to open one of these cans in search of the artist would actually lead to a destruction of this artwork. One could say that Manzoni's Merda d'Artista stages the specific value form of the art commodity while mocking it at the same time. The remaining privileges of artistic labor. Let's start by considering Manzoni's Merda d'Artista again, but now in terms of labor. There is an emphasis put on industrial labor via seriality and reproduction in this work. But industrial labor also gets combined with a claim of authenticity, considering that the work contains the original traces of the artist. It is as if Manzoni wanted to have the cake and eat it too. He holds onto the specificity of artistic labor while opting for an impersonal and non-expressive style of production at the same time. Next to the artwork's material uniqueness and the symbolic achievements made by or claimed for it, it is, in my kind of personal value theory, it is the specificity of artistic labor that finally contributes to art's specific value form. Artistic labor usually consists of both immaterial and material labor because it involves ideas and concepts as much as a material process of making. Industrial procedures and manual work often get conflated in artistic labor as well. Now, there have been many sociologists, philosophers, and cultural historians, from Pierre-Michel Monger to Stefano Harney and Marina Wischmitz. All these scholars pointed to the increasing despecification of artistic labor, which supposedly has become more and more managerial and resembles general labor in many respects. Next to the invasion of management into art, this is how Stefano Harney calls it, next to this, entering of management into art, something that is, I guess, most emblematically represented and embodied by conceptual art, management itself has taken art as its model as well. More so, it has been demonstrated by Boltanski-Schiapello in The New Spirit of Capitalism how formerly artistic virtues such as creativity, virtuosity, or flexibility came to be highly valued in the working world. And indeed, creative subjects are currently most wanted by employers and companies. This implies that those emancipatory ideals formerly associated with artistic critique, such as autonomy or self-determination, have also been transformed into something of a curse in the current economy, where everybody is expected to assume individual responsibility for themselves, an individual responsibility that leads to a more intense and more subtle version of self-exploitation. From an art historical perspective, one could equally argue that artists are increasingly expected to market themselves, at least since the so-called conceptual turn in the 60s. They are expected to think in a way that is economic and speculative. And this is something Marina Wischmitz has demonstrated. With these developments in mind, it has often been argued that artistic labor and general labor overlap in many ways. But this overlap between artistic labor and general labor, in my opinion, does not mean that there are no differences between them. Despite the economic pressures entering artists' studio, their labor, I would argue, their labor is still characterized by what I would describe as residual privileges, privileges creative workers can only dream of. Unlike most creative workers, artists can decide upon the rhythm and upon the goal of their work. And more so, in contrast to the creative worker, artists usually have a product as a result of their work at their disposal, a product that relates to them as their maker. Some artists, and here artists like Jeff Koons or Olafur Eliasson come to mind, some artists have even opted to follow in the steps of so-called entrepreneur artists like Rubens or Rembrandt, and thus cultivate an entrepreneurial self, which means that they delegate labor to others, often badly paid assistants, and they run their studios like a company. So, structurally speaking, these artists, and maybe most artists even, are positioned more closely to the social position of business people. They are structurally speaking positioned closer to the ruling classes than to the position of wage laborers. While artistic labor and general labor certainly have become closer to one another, artists still dispose of manifold residual privileges. Privileges, I would argue, that get condensed in the specific value form of the products that actually results from their labor. Moreover, considering that we are increasingly operating in a digital economy, it is manual artistic labor in particular, say the laboring on a material picture that we imagine for painters, that represents a fascinating anachronism in such an economy. This might explain the occasional enthusiasm for painted pictures in such an economy. I just realized that the second part of the image is in another file, which I haven't prepared. So what I will do now, because I don't want to be longer than 15 minutes more at the most, I will talk to you about the value problems caused by the pandemic without showing images. I'm sorry about that. I kind of assumed that the images would be here. So I want to finally demonstrate how art's specific value form actually gets affected by the current conditions of a global pandemic. Some of the premises and operations that I have outlined so far show themselves in a different light in such a crisis. Consider the series of lockdowns since March 2020 and the closed art institutions, cancelled exhibitions, biennials and art fairs that resulted from them. It became difficult, if not impossible, to perceive artworks as unique material objects or as immaterial performances that leave material traces. And it became equally hard to grasp what is symbolically at stake in them once you only encountered them online. the specific artistic labor that has been expended for them also vanishes to the background when the traces of this labor, often deliberately produced, can no longer be detected. Some artists started to post images of themselves, like images of themselves working, say on Instagram, which could be seen as an attempt to compensate for this lack while feeding mythical projections. As an antidote to this situation, many galleries, museums, and art fairs initiated a flight into so-called online showrooms since the beginning of the pandemic. But these online showrooms pose problems as well when considered from a value theoretical perspective. First of all, there are many artworks, especially painted pictures, that provide textures and surfaces that are hard to mediate and grasp online. I'm thinking here, for instance, of Chabalala Self's paintings in this respect. The fact that their pictorial rhetoric consists of collage textiles is next to impossible to see online. There's another problem with online showrooms. Artworks tend to be presented in them like, yes, I would say like context-free monads. Artworks appear like context-free monads in these online showrooms, as if they were meaningful as such, as if that which is or was historically at stake in them were self-understood. Sometimes the galleries provide editorials, written editorials to accompany these artworks online, but I think they can't solve this problem since they are mostly promotional and sound like press release texts. And once you visit an exhibition online, you furthermore have to perceive the works in the way the camera wants you to perceive it, even though your own perceptual habits might be quite different. As far as I'm concerned, I often simply don't want to perceive an artwork or an installation in the way the camera forces me to perceive it. And more importantly, so-called online showrooms are no substitute for all those social rituals that lead to the assessment of value, such as openings or dinners. Social gatherings of this type had all been cancelled due to the pandemic law of social distancing. This caused problems for the value of art, considering how this value is based on social exchange, as not only Marx, but later also Georg Simmel pointed out. So in a situation where no exchange process is possible, value naturally stands on feeble grounds. Once these communicative rituals are missing, rituals that allow for the formation of the affect commun and the way it determines, confirms, or refuses value, once these communicative rituals are missing, we are faced with a situation where value becomes rather fragile. Add to these problems the general atmosphere of mistrust that emerged during the pandemic, where you couldn't even trust the air that you were breathing anymore, as the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa pointed out. Once mistrust reigns as the dominant social effect, it becomes more difficult to make people believe in artworks and in their future value potential. Yeah, I will go on a little bit more because I want to briefly also talk about race and gender as factors that impact on the process of value generation. Because, you know, artworks similar to other goods, artworks are exposed to a permanent circuit between value assignment and loss of value. And in view of the recent social protest movements such as Black Lives Matter or Me Too, I have asked myself why those fictional expectations that are supposed to be crucial for the process of value attribution turn out differently when the author of an artwork is imagined to be Black or female. On first examination, such value discrimination seems to naturally result from the basic structure of Orléans' affect commun, or more precisely from its mimetic nature. Because according to Orléans, this desire invests itself only in certain artworks while ignoring all others. This is due to its mimetic nature. What it desires is that which is assumed to be desired by others. We can thus explain the great discrepancies in terms of monetary value in the global art business with the always same direction the mimetic collective desire is taking. It always goes in the direction of, say, Gerhard Richter. However, the fact that this desire preferably invests itself in the works of white male artists needs further explanation. Apart from a few exceptions, I would mention Cindy Sherman, David Hammons, Carrie James Marshall here, artists marked as female or black have been traditionally excluded from the upper segment of the auction business, an exclusion that currently seems to be slightly rectified. But for a long time, the only black artist whose work figured prominently in auctions, albeit only posthumously, was Jean-Michel Basquiat. The long-standing institutional discrimination of artists marked as black or female points to those unacknowledged value systems, as Linda Nochlin calls them, that still operate in today's racial and sexist capitalism. Nochlin famously argued that it was due to institutional structures that female artists in particular didn't get recognized as great artists for a long time. Women artists were indeed kept out of art institutions for a long time and thus became relegated to the art world's margins. I quote Nochlin, "Deprived of encouragements, educational facilities or rewards, it is almost incredible that a certain percentage of women did persevere and seek a profession of the arts." While the methods of institutional exclusion, discrimination and discouragements obviously became more subtle since, it is still considered exceptional for a woman artist or for a black artist to achieve artistic excellence and market success on the same footing as white male artists. The situation for black artists is further aggravated, as Megan O'Grady pointed out. For a long time, the license to free expression that, I quote, white male artists have been granted by birthright hasn't been available to black artists. One might add here that the notion of free expression is already deeply entangled in white male privilege. It is a freedom that, structurally speaking, relies on others to pay the price for it. For those who are excluded from it, it is hard and somewhat paradoxical to claim this freedom for themselves. But why is it that the assumption of an artist's identity as black or female marks the reception of her work so strongly? We need to turn to this theory of reception in order to understand this process more accurately. When an artwork is perceived by a recipient, the recipient produces fictive speculations about its author. At least this is how the German reception theorist Wolfgang Kemp put it. Once an artwork is perceived, what immediately happens, according to him, is fictive speculations about the author of the artworks are taking place. So the recipient immediately speculates about the author's identity when contemplating her work. This means, of course, that her assumed identity as female or black will affect the recipient's value judgment, which itself reflects unacknowledged value systems, as Nochlin pointed out. The viewer's identitarian assumptions might be reductivist and essentializing, but they do make a difference for the process of value attribution. A lesser worth is thus attributed to the work as soon as its maker is imagined to be black or female. This fixation on the person behind the product is also an outcome of the artwork's specific value form. Considering that the artwork's uniqueness derives from the singularity of its author, it is no wonder that the common desire tends to fixate itself on this author. It tends to be extremely interested in the person behind the product. And this person that is imagined behind the product raises interest and curiosity precisely because it functions as a guarantor of the value form. So it is here that we have come full circle. Add to this the laws of celebrity culture and how they have entered and shaped the art world since the 1990s. Celebrity culture implies that products get personalized, and in such an economy, the pull toward the artist behind her work becomes even stronger. So I think I had more, but I think I will stop here. I have last reflections we can maybe talk about when we have the discussion about the possibility of, like, is it possible or even wishable to leave the value sphere altogether? And I also had a little part on Carrie James Marshall work, but I think I laid out the kind of basic lines of my attempts toward value theory of art, and I also try to think about the way value stands on feeble ground in a pandemic, and I also try to point to possible reasons as to why value discriminations have traditionally occurred as soon as one is dealing with supposedly female or Black artists. So maybe this was a kind of panorama, and I always like to have a lot of time for the discussion. So I would like to, invite you to ask questions via chat, right, Carlos? Via chat, and then the questions will be.
Ya están entrando una serie de preguntas, ya están empezando a aparecer, están siendo recopiladas, así que dentro de poco vamos a empezar a leer esas preguntas. Muchísimas gracias, Isabel. Confío que me quedé muy intrigado por esto último que dijiste, de cuáles serían las estrategias para abandonar la value sphere, ¿no? Cómo podría ser un arte que no exista dentro de una atmósfera vinculada a sus sistemas de valoración. Pero bueno, vamos a empezar con las preguntas. Yo voy a empezar con una pregunta mía que te quería hacer, que tiene un poco que ver con una situación con la situación específica de lo que es el mercado del arte en Argentina y la pregunta por la creación de valor dentro del mercado argentino. Hay algo que es bastante claro, que es que los precios de los artistas argentinos generalmente se percibe que son muy baratos en relación al mercado del arte internacional. Eso tiene un efecto que es especulativo, y es que se piensa que un artista que posiblemente en algún momento de su carrera dé ese salto al mercado internacional, su obra adquiriría un valor muy superior solamente por dar ese salto. Obviamente eso muchas veces no ocurre, y eso hace que sea difícil crear un mercado del arte coherente con la realidad económica de este país. Entonces mi pregunta para vos tiene un poco que ver con una pregunta que veo en el chat, es ¿cuáles son los instrumentos que vos considerás legítimos para sostener el valor de una producción artística en una escena específica, como por ejemplo en este caso es la Argentina, pero supongo que es extendible a muchas otras escenas?
Yeah, maybe is it okay if I also answer to Marina's question, because I feel like I feel like my conclusion is due. Otherwise, it's a bit half-hearted. So maybe I before answering this question, which is very difficult for me, of course, because I don't know the Argentinian art market so well, and I also, I consider myself an art theorist and not really, I would be very reluctant to think in terms of solutions or recipes or advices. I'm more interested to think about problems. But maybe I need to say something, because I think what the question, of course, is do things have to be this way? And one could, of course, ask also in view of the protest movements that I mentioned, such as Black Lives Matter or Me Too, one could ask whether these social movements, they exerted a high degree of pressure, thankfully. And we can ask now, will this lead to a lessening of discrimination in the different value spheres of the art world? Can we thus hope for a future where the identities imagined for artists or claimed by artists, identities such as female or black, can we imagine a future where these imagined and claimed identities won't have any repercussions on the process of value creation anymore? And we might also, say that for some time now, we can observe an effort toward more diversity in the art world, which is, of course, a very positive thing. Most gallerists and arts institutions try to integrate Black artists into their program, for instance, and try to opt for more diverse programs, which sometimes means that structural sexism slightly gets pushed to the background as if it didn't exist. But I think actually that an intersectional approach would be preferable here, that analyzes the specificities and overlaps of different forms of discrimination. But the question remains whether all these institutional efforts and initiatives, will they only be short-lived in a way similar to the early 90s, or whether these efforts and initiatives will lead to a deep and durable change in the value sphere. And it is, of course, hard to predict what will happen, but the writer Hilton Als recently made a rather pessimistic remark in this respect. He fears a backlash, in the course of which white heterosexual maleness will be declared to be the norm once again, a future where declaring one's solidarity with Black Lives Matter won't pay off anymore. Such a backlash could indeed be on the horizon, but it is equally possible, I think, that the current institutional changes, provided that they are not just cosmetic, provided that these changes are not just cosmetic, I think they might prove to be not so easily reversible. As for the art world, we also shouldn't forget that this is a universe that relies on unjustly distributed values, on a certain degree of value discrimination, if you wish. One could even go so far to say that, structurally speaking, every market successful position here is reached at the expense of all those positions that remain invisible. The utopian vision of a society where all lives are equally valuable and thus grievable, as envisioned by Judith Butler in her book The Force of Nonviolence, this utopian vision of equally valuable and grievable lives can hardly be transposed onto the art market, because artworks are, especially once they circulate as commodities in the value sphere, they are characterized by their differences. They're characterized by their differences in terms of their materiality, in terms of their symbolic propositions, and in terms of the artistic labor that has been expended for them. And these differences also manifest themselves in their value form. And as long as the capitalist system, and with it the art market, are structured by value, and as long as artistic production aims at generating value, I'm afraid that we will keep encountering unjust and discriminating attributions of a more or lesser value. And maybe the way to go, one could say now, maybe the way to go is to abolish value altogether, value generating artistic production included. And this is something Moishe Postone envisioned, the abolition of the value sphere. But such an abolishment of value doesn't seem to be on the agenda right now. And I'm honestly also not totally sure if we should long for such an abolishment in the case of artistic production and reception, because both seem to be characterized by gestures and performances that discriminate. Artists and critics make discriminatory value judgments in their work. And maybe what has to change is not the law of value, but the formal gestures with which we produce, receive, and judge artworks. And yesterday I looked at a conversation with that Alexander Kluge conducted with the sociologist Niklas Luhmann, the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, in 1994. And there's a moment where Luhmann says, paradise is an order without any distinction. But as soon as there was the forbidden fruit, and as soon, as paradise was lost, distinctions got introduced. And then I thought, once distinctions get introduced, this implies judgments, distinctions, value. So in a way, this value, this kind of a society with an end of value, as Postone imagined it, would be like paradise, possibly, and a kind of world without distinctions. Like if one really thinks this through, that's just something that maybe we should aim for. But as an art critic who makes distinctions all the time, that's my business. I'm making distinctions, and I'm also trying to find criteria for my judgments. And I, of course, do it in a way that is situated and provisional. And I don't claim that this is the final world, but to give all this up would be difficult, to say the least.
Como mínimo difícil, sí. Tenemos algunas preguntas muy interesantes, ahora ya tenemos un montón de preguntas, podemos avanzar con algunas. Tenemos una pregunta de Sol Ganim, que pregunta si el valor simbólico percibido de las obras de arte hacia el interior del campo artístico y el valor comercial de las obras de arte, que es algo que muchas veces se ve hacia el público general, ayudan a que la sociedad considere que la práctica artística es indispensable e importante para la cultura, o va en detrimento de la sensación de que la práctica artística es importante para la cultura. Me parece interesante esta pregunta porque trae la mirada de un público no experto, ¿no? ¿Cómo percibe un público no experto la noción de valor?
I didn't understand the beginning. What was the first point? I mean, it's symbolic value. Well, I didn't quite understand the very beginning of the question. Sorry.
La voy a hacer en inglés, que me va a salir un poco mejor. La pueden escuchar traducida igual. Tell me, do you listen to me if I speak like this, Isabel?
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. I think the question tries to go to the point of whether the notion of symbolic value of art and monetary value, if the visibility of this value and the growth of this value serves so that society thinks that art is an important aspect of culture.
Oh,
creates, or if it's the opposite effect.
Yeah, I think, first of all, maybe I should have made this more clear. For me, the artwork commodity, once artworks circulate in the value sphere, they are commodities, but commodities of a special kind, because unlike the Marxian commodity, they do not eclipse their labor conditions, but they suggest that their labor conditions are intrinsic to them. And these artworks as commodities are internally split between their symbolic and between their market value. And there is a tension between the two. Their symbolic value consists of many, many things. It consists of the whole idea of modern art, autonomy, purposefulness. All these idealist concepts from the 18th century are, contributing to art's symbolic value. But then it's also more specific. It's the concrete, symbolic kind of performance that a work is supposedly delivering according to critics. This is also everything critics and curators say about it and have written about it. This constitutes the symbolic value as well. And the market value is actually an expression of articulates, it's articulated by its price. So there's a tension between the two. This means that an artwork that has a lot of symbolic value, say an artwork that is highly regarded by the artist's peers, by critic friends, can have very little market value. Vice versa, an artwork in the auction sphere that attains very high prices can do so without having renowned art historians writing about the work. So on the one hand, one could say these values are rather independent from each other, but then that's also not true, because if you look more closely, in the long run, you know, the artist who is very market successful in the auction sphere but has no art historian writing about her will do everything she or he can to get this kind of critical credibility, because it's the kind of substance, the symbolic value, a market value without any symbolic value is hard to sustain a la longue. The same is true in the other direction. Symbolic value, if there have been many artists in the history of art, like Kadere would be one so-called artist, who had a lot of support from their peers, at the latest posthumously, this symbolic value will transform into market value. Of course, there's no guarantee for this transformation. It might also not work. So, and I think that, of course, these and then there's something else that is important. Symbolic value, by definition, is something that is priceless. And since symbolic value is basically the foundation of the artwork's market value, the price of an artwork can be, it's like open-ended, because there is no adequate price for it. And this is why we have these ununderstandably high and abstract prices at time. This is an expression, in a way, of the non-measurability of symbolic value. So the fact that there are these prices, of course, points to, something like cultural relevance, and also leads to people, who are outsiders and not experts, getting more attracted by the art world. I mean, the art world has gone through a structural transformation since the 90s, where big corporations, big global corporations started to replace local galleries, and where a whole new type of financialized collectors started to enter this field. And of course, not only because of the prices, because these prices, they are so ununderstandable because of this irreducibility of art, because there is this ungraspable symbolic value that can't be translated into money.
There is an interesting question that I think links to this one, related to Maurizio Cattelan's banana with duct tape. And they are asking how was value generated, if you have any theory on how value was generated in that piece. And I think that there is an interesting link with the previous question, because one could argue that the value generation of that piece was the fact that society at large thought there was no correlation between commodity value and labor value in a piece like that. And the radicality of that difference is what made it a meme, made it be on Instagram, made it be on shirts, transformed it into a very culturally impactful image, even if it was like what it was, a banana with duct tape. Have you given thought to that specific case?
I haven't thought about this work. For me, it would be now easier to think about Banksy in this respect, because it's similar, and I think, first of all, I think that these gestures always come with this kind of slightly bad boy, underground, like frisson, and épaté le bourgeois type, avant-gardistic avant-gardistic pose, and I think the career of Catalan and also Banksy proves how these proto-avant-gardistic épaté le bourgeois, seemingly underground gestures are perfectly integratable, have really lost their, how can I say, their emancipatory potentials, are precisely what is loved and expected from an artist. And I also think that, you know, both I think the banana is, of course, it's, you know, it's this kind of iconic work in my kind of world of artists and art historians. Nobody ever speaks about this work, and nobody also ever speaks about Banksy, and nobody ever speaks about NFTs for this matter, because it's just not considered so interesting. It more happens in the kind of mainstream media world where maybe, you know, I mean, I like Catalan's piece when he taped his gallerist at the wall. I thought that was interesting because that was precisely at the time when this structural change happened in the 90s, when galleries stopped being, you know, these local shops, but became these global mega structures, and where also, you know, where it was not anymore about a gallery accompanying her artists a lifetime, but it was more, you know, about only showing what sells. And if you don't sell as an artist, the gallery will stop the business relation with you, which was not the case in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, you had galleries that had a bunch of artists, and they stayed with them for 30 years. And that stopped in the 90s too. So this kind of, and it also points to the sadomasochistic relationship between dealers and artists. I mean, many dealers I know secretly hate their artist and vice versa. Of course, there's this official "I love art and artists are so important" discourse, but underneath there's lots of resentment. So I thought the work captured that as well, and the kind of secret desire of actually, you know, mistreating your dealer. But in general, these kind of populistic underground gestures, I think, you know, I wrote a whole text on Banksy, so I think it's interesting to think about them, but it's certainly not aesthetic complexity that you find here. It's something else, you know.
That's very interesting. I think that there's something that to me is fascinating about the question of aesthetic complexity and what kind of discrimination that creates from like more popular artists, and then from people that consider themselves artists but are not considered as artists by the intellectual contemporary art scene because they just do fan art, for example. I think there is a lot to be said about.
Yeah, and of course, you know, to speak like this about aesthetic complexity, I sound like Clement Greenberg. I mean, it's of course very very dubious and can also sound very conservative, and, you know, a one-liner and something deliberately aesthetically under-complex can be very interesting as well. I think it's more when the strategy is completely transparent and the message, and, you know, and when it also works in the way that it has been intended. I'm naturally a bit less interested, because I like also to be confronted with something which I don't completely understand, or which I find maybe, you know, which I'm maybe also disturbed by or intrigued by in a kind of negative way. Yeah, I think I would not want to uphold aesthetic complexity as my aesthetic criteria. Certainly not, because you know, many artists have successfully rejected that, and since, you know, Duchamp, so to speak, this notion or this idea. But yeah.
I think there was.
That's an English question.
There are questions in English. Are you reading that one?
Yeah, I'm trying. Do you believe that in modern society, which is getting more and more virtual, the main players in the dressing and establishing value second market will suffice with establishing on art in a virtual way, or will art need to be valued physically, including the mentioned expectation of the aggregate value of the artist himself? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's an open question at this point. I think that, you know, of course, there has been this shift to so-called online showrooms, and I have forgotten to mention that next to their downsides, they also have virtues. One being that there's more accessibility, and secondly, there's a tendency to make the prices of the work transparent, which is usually not the case. Usually, when you go to an art fair as a not collector, you're not told the prices. So there's that, and I think that, of course, I think that you know, dealers are trying to find ways when presenting these works which implicates their maker. I can say, for instance, from my own experience with Texte zur Kunst, when we sell editions with Texte zur Kunst online, and it always works best if we show the artist signing the work or making the work, or if there's some sort of physical connection between the artist and her work, graspable and visible, then this really helps. And of course, it could also be helpful to kind of reconstruct the conditions of production, the kind of horizon, like why was this work made? What was at stake? What is at stake in it? This is something that is very hard to grasp in these online formats. So I think that, you know, the online selling opportunities will expand and continue. But what I have noticed now, just a week before Art Basel is happening here, dealers are so happy that they can go and meet people in person again and sell the works live and so on. They can't wait. I mean, of course, it's exhausting and everything, but there is also a kind of, I mean, they all seem to be very sure that this will continue as well, and this is important, and this is the real thing, and this is how they like to operate. But, you know, many of them also, you know, like Johann König would be one example of a dealer who has a kind of Instagram account where he constantly shows himself and speaks and personalizes his whole business, and tries to, you know, it's his official aim. He wants to reach a wider audience. He wants to leave this expert world and get people outside of the so-called art world interested. So he's doing something online all the time, a podcast, Instagram, and it works. And he has, you know, many more people buying in his gallery. So I think that this will definitely continue. But I also think that, you know, these live exchanges, the dinners, the conversations, which are important for what I described as common emotion, or, you know, Orléans' affect commun, this collective mimetic desire, you know, which consists of, it's like a convergence of individual desires. So how do these desires converge? They need occasions, you know, and one needs to, you know, these dinners and openings are ways of finding out what the other desires and comparing notes and so on. It's crucial for the generation of value. So I think that, yeah, that these kind of live openings and dinners are definitely here to stay.
Since we're in the subject of virtuality, there's a question regarding NFTs. We would love to hear you say something about that. I think that there is a very interesting discussion about labor and NFTs. The NFT by Beeple that was sold for $69 million had a lot of labor in it because it was 5,000 images put inside of it. So there was a whole discussion on whether, even though a lot of people thought that the pieces themselves were horrible in a certain way or not art in some discriminatory category, there was a lot of labor in there, and that was part of the value. Of course, part of the value probably also was just to establish NFTs as a thing in themselves. There is some suspicion that maybe that's part of what happened, that the price was taken up so that NFTs were like big news and had cultural impact. But still, I think there's something interesting regarding the specifics of NFTs and value, and we would love to hear you say something about that.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. First of all, there's a whole chapter of my value theory that I spared you, which is actually quite important, because it's very important to understand that you know, first of all, as I said, value is not price. Value is commodity value, and it consists of labor in marks that it gets obscured and abstracted from. It consists of abstract labor, and what I try to show for art commodities is that, one, their value is relational and social as well, but two, they have this capacity to suggest that their value is substantial. But the amount or the labor time is not at all deciding upon the kind of how do you call it, Größe, the amount of value, or the like, say that an artist labors on her work for 30 hours. And if you work with an expanded notion of labor, you include social labor, immaterial labor, like, the artist hangs out in bars and drinks and networks like crazy, and all this networking energy and immaterial labor, ideas, and also manual labor, all this gets into the work. This doesn't mean at all that it will have value. There is no guarantee for that value. It's really not deciding. And I think that it was a bit misleading that Beeple's the kind of price, for me it was to kind of justify the price of this work with the amount of labor is a desperate attempt for me to make it plausible, to make something plausible that can't be made plausible. So and I think it's also really interesting that this whole NFT thing, it's like, when did it happen? It happened right at the time where we encountered a weakening of the art world infrastructures, because museums went through a crisis of legitimation. They were financially weakened by the lockdown closures. They also were confronted with legitimate requests from social movements like Black Lives Matter. So this whole art world infrastructure was, and the analog one was, in a crisis. And at that particular moment, a digital phenomenon pops up in a way, leaving traditional art institutions aside, leaving expert culture aside, not bothering about critics or art historians, and claiming art status for itself. And for me, what's most interesting about these NFTs is, like, for one, historically speaking, the NFT can be seen in a continuity with certificates. with this certificates from the 60s, such as the one by Yves Klein, which I showed to you. What does a certificate do? A certificate kind of what it allows its collector is to kind of own an immaterial action, and it's like a relic because it seems to like physically relate to that. So for me, the certificate is the analog thing, and the NFT is the digital version, because the NFT gives unique status to the digital immaterial work. But what is so interesting for me is to see that uniqueness is the kind of main point of the NFT, the focus on uniqueness, and how can you provide uniqueness in this format of a digital property. And that's interesting because uniqueness, in my personal theory of art, is what makes artworks commodities of a special kind. They're one-off. They are material one-offs, not immaterial one-offs, but material one-offs. Or if they are immaterial one-offs, they are immaterial one-offs which leave material traces. So the NFT, in a way, for me, is not at all so far away from the traditional artwork, because it really puts its emphasis on uniqueness. That's rather traditional at the end of the day, to provide uniqueness to a unique artwork and digital property to its owner.
That's very interesting. Yes, some digital artists say that NFTs were empowering for them because it was the first time that their work could be collected, that it was impossible to really collect digital artists' work until now. Of course,
yes,
there are exceptions, but...
Yeah. That's a very important point that I also wanted to make by pointing back to Seyss-Siegelaub's contract. You remember Seyss-Siegelaub in the 60s developed this contract, which was an attempt to allow artists more control about the distribution of their works, like resales, and to make sure that they would get a percentage if there is a resale, that they would know if there is a resale. And this contract, as you probably know, failed. I think apart from Hans Hacke, no artist uses it, because of course galleries don't want to deal with this, collectors. And I think that's the interesting potential of the NFT, is that it could provide more control of distribution to artists. And this is where it's promising and where it's really interesting. Completely independently of the aesthetic part of it, which I think is, for me, that's not the crucial point. The crucial point is an attempt to have artists, to empower artists in this whole art market game.
Yes, for those that are not familiar, NFTs can have smart contracts which are automatically executed at the moment of a sale. So you could have like a percentage over secondary sales, and there is no way that the seller could avoid paying the artists for it. It's like a fail-proof contract kind of system, and that's something very interesting.
But it also seems, I don't know what you think, Carlos, but my impression is that the NFT hype is already over. I mean, it was rather short-lived, no? I mean, there was a time here.
I agree. But I think I think that the blockchain technology is revolutionary enough that even if the bubble bursts in 10 years, something will remain from it.
Yeah.
A lot of comparisons are made to the Nasdaq, to the .com bubble, and that when it exploded, people said, "See, I told you, it was a bubble." And now, 20 years later, internet is everything, and it's the biggest companies, and they have great revenues. So even though I'm sure that it's a bubble in a way, and that it was a hyped up thing, I think that if you look at it, there is some revolutionary potential in things like what you're saying, the smart contracts and the capacity for the artists to really have a hard-coded, hardwired control of their productions.
Yes, and also to kind of completely circumvent the gallery system.
Exactly, exactly.
And to even circumvent the agent or any mediators. And this is something, which there seems to be, I think we are dealing with a structural change in the art world that is similar to the one in the 90s. And I think that nobody quite knows how it will end and what it will look like. But my impression is that there is also a willingness on the part of many artists to stop, this natural law that, if you work with the gallery gets 50%, and all these things. I think it's a bit up for grabs and questioned. And do we actually need the gallery in this kind of new value sphere that is partly online? How will it work? It's unclear. And I'm sorry, I didn't really answer the Argentina question. I feel that I'm really not qualified because I haven't studied the Argentinian art market, to be honest. I studied the one I'm myself kind of part of, which is, and I know there's not only one, and there are different market spheres, but I felt a bit shy to make
of course
claims.
It's a very open question. I think that the challenge is to understand how an emerging art scene manages to develop, and because it has this sort of pre-emergence in which everything is very distorted because there is too much speculation on the relationship with the international art scene. And I think that there is like a previous stage, which is sort of the local development, which I think it's happening slowly. But I also studied economics. I'm not sure if I mentioned that at some point. So I'm interested in that aspect of the art world and also art production and production of meaning.
What is happening definitely in Germany is a kind of relocalization. I mean, you have many very interesting kind of alternative spaces and initiatives going on in smaller German cities, and not necessarily in Berlin. So there's a kind of emphasis on local scenes, and it's not anymore absolutely de rigueur to move to Berlin. Things are shifting.
That happened during the pandemic, or was it previously happening?
Yeah, it started already previously, but I just, I see it also with the students from Städelschule in the old days. They were all moving to Berlin, and this is not the case. Many stay in Frankfurt or go elsewhere.
That's very interesting. There's another question. Somebody wants to see if you could name some examples of artists that hack this specific form of creating value, this general this value sphere maybe that you were mentioning, artists that are hacking that kind of thing, trying to go in another direction. And specifically, she would like to know if you know any Latin American women painters who are doing that in one way or another. But I think it's interesting in general to hear you talk about what artists you think are doing something interesting in terms of escaping the value sphere, which I love as a term. I'm totally going to start using it.
I think, I gave a talk once called No Exit, art in the value sphere. I don't think that an escape is possible. I think that what is possible is to negotiate these conditions differently. And I mean, there's an Argentinian artist whose work I love is Valentina Leonor, but I don't think that I could now, relate her work to value reflexivity in my book. But another artist two artists who I think have really gone very far in this kind of value reflexive register that I'm interested in is Andrea Fraser and Merlin Carpenter. You know, for me, Andrea Fraser's performance, Official Welcome, but also Untitled, and the emphasis on, you know, her own persona and body as, you know, as a kind of as an object that creates value and is desired by this affaire commun, and, you know, and the way she exposes that while reflecting upon it, you know, and also refusing traditional product production. I mean, I think she's one of the artists who most consequently has, apart from herself as, you know, this persona, no products that circulate in the market, maybe with the exception of some posters. But the price she pays for this is that this persona she created is the product, and the way she deals with that without exiting. I mean, she exited the value sphere for some years. She actually stopped working as an artist, and I think she wanted to become a psychoanalyst, but then she kind of came back. So she did the exit. So I think that's interesting. And I'm very interested in, you know, the Merlin Carpenter's attempts to reflect on value in his texts. I mean, he has written a text called The Outside Can't Go Outside, which is his own value theory, so to speak. And he has done shows like one a couple of years ago in Berlin, when Berlin was still imagined to be this, you know, very democratic, accessible, non-hierarchical space, which in reality, of course, it wasn't. Then he had a show which was called Entrance 5,000 euro. So you had to pay 5,000 euro if you were to see the paintings. And of course, people were incredibly angry and outraged. But what he actually pointed to is the fact that Berlin was turning into this VIP world where a certain very rich class was you know was actually allowed in, and not everybody. So these are artists I follow and I'm very interested in. I love Kerry James Marshall's auction paintings, and I wanted actually to show them in my talk, but there wasn't enough time. I think his auction paintings are incredible because they, first of all, do justice to this idea that, you know, that what counts is not so much the product, but the person behind the product. So in his auction paintings, you have names of the artist and you have the prices of their work. And it looks like a pop art painting of like supermarket ads. And then on top of it, he also analyzes value discrimination by comparing the auctions for, you know, for typical white blue chip male artists, where Richter and Christopher Wool and so on have prices. But then he also, in his paintings, you can see how women artists appear in these contexts only as exceptions. You always have one exceptional woman artist like Bridget Riley or Joan Mitchell in these auctions. And then you have auction houses like Swan Auction House, where mostly black artists are auctioned. And there's an artist like, say, Norman Lewis, who I would say is as important as Gerhard Richter, whose work is auctioned for very little money. So there are all these, you know, and he implicates himself in this because he did these auction paintings immediately after his own painting was auctioned for record price. So there was a self-reflexive moment there as well. So I'm a fan of Kerry James Marshall's auction paintings in this regard. And yeah, I could go on, and we possibly will have more time also tomorrow in the seminar to look at value reflexive practices.
That's interesting. I think we have time for one more question. I think this is a very interesting question by Emilia Casiva. She asks if the reassessment of value of artists belonging to minorities somehow transforms the notion of value. And I think in this case, she's talking of symbolic value or value for the society of these artists or of these minorities, or whether you think these reassessments of value occur in terms of redistribution of wealth, the effort of generating more representativity, you know, like wealth redistribution, if it's like a reparations thing, I guess, or whether it is really being capable of changing notions of value in society.
Yeah, it's funny. I just had a conversation about this with Julie Meritou, and we were both agreeing that we are sensing the backlash already, and that on the other hand, the institutional structural changes were so deep that there is hope that they can't be, you know,
they can't go back
so quickly. But I would say that reassessments, you know, in this sense, I would say, I think it doesn't mean that the notion of value, in my term, it's commodity value, has to be changed. I would rather say that this kind of value is very expansive. It's, you know, it's very able to subsume also minority artists, you know, no problem. I think that the value in a way is even, it's even, how can I say, it's a bit similar to what I tried to say about the materials when I explained how, you know, artists like Beuys or Dieter Roth, by using, you know, materials that evaporate and that decay, you know, this was read at the time as threatening, you know, the value form, but it actually led to an expansion of the value form, because it's of course able via restoration to incorporate all that. And I think the same is true with the current, let's say, trend. You know, there is also a fashion, you know, going on. I think no gallery can afford nowadays to only show white male artist. You know, it's something you can't do right now. But the question is like whether, I think the question is whether this will affect, you know, the power structures, and who's in charge and who makes the decision and who really has the money. And I don't see so many changes there. So that's why I'm not so sure that we are dealing, and Julie Meritou shared my opinion. We were wondering, you know, if we will have to cope with a situation where with this opening that we are currently thankfully witnessing, there will be a closure again. And then we were discussing, so what can we do to prevent that or to fight against that? And
who do you think would be the agent of that closing? Like the art market itself, the boards of museums, a demand of the public of museums? Who do you think would be the agent?
I think it's interesting to look at the early 90s in that respect. There was also, if you think of the Whitney Biennial from 1993, there was a reassessment going on then. But it was less like the structural changes were definitely less steep. And I think it's very difficult to really point to the agents, because it's a constellation, and it's also a kind of a mood. But I remember the second half of the 90s as completely dominated by the celebrity principle, as having forgotten all the artists, many artists who were very successful in the Whitney Biennial. And I remember this time as the time where this art world restructured and became this global industry. So since we are also currently dealing with a restructuring, on this business level, I wonder, but I would hope also that, the power of the social movements, I think, which really very much contributed to this current pressures. I just hope that it will stay, and that since so many people have been, at least, in the American museums in particular, but also in Germany, in all the institutions, there have been so many appointments that go in a different direction. Of course, people can be not prolonged or thrown out, or but I hope that this kind of reassessment will stay and be further, intensified.
That's very interesting. So it's really an open question whether
I think it's right now it's open.
Yeah, as is probably the future of the art market and the art world itself, right? After the pandemic, it's hard to know what things will go back to the way they were, and what things will really have changed forever in terms of virtuality.
I have the impression there's a lot is changing. A lot is changing, and we can't really grasp it now. So I think in terms of hierarchies, power relation, who's on top, who's, I think everything is a bit reshuffled, and but it's unclear as to what direction this will go. And this is why everybody's also, at least this is what I perceive, there's a certain degree of nervousness. And there's this very strange escape to the resorts. You have many dealers who open galleries in rich resorts, like from Aspen to Monaco to be nearer the very rich people. So this is going on as well. So sometimes I wonder whether galleries will maybe only exist in these resorts in the future, and only have this function for these, private plane owners. I don't know. But it's, yes. And then there are a lot of interesting, new spaces, new initiatives, and questionings of old hierarchies. Even if you look at the auction market, you can observe that artists who have been believed in, by actors of the market for many years are completely on the downfall right now. So things are being shaken up.
Right. And to end with a happy note, we can say that it matters what we do about it to see what shape the art world finally takes. So
yeah, it's difficult enough to get some sort of make sense of it, I guess. Yeah.
Yes. So great. There's a few questions we couldn't answer, but I think most of them were covered pretty well. Thank you so much, Isabelle, for being today with us.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you to everybody who I don't see. Unfortunately, it's very ghost-like to imagine that there are people listening. I hope it was understandable, and I hope that my English was not sounding too German.
Muchas gracias a todos y todas por estar.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Podés ver que hay muchos comentarios ahora de agradecimiento en el chat, como para que los fantasmas se disipen y se transformen en personas. Gracias a todos por participar, por sus preguntas. Fue una gran conversación, y espero verlos muy pronto en nuestras clases, en nuestras aulas y conversaciones. Gracias, Isabelle, otra vez, y que tengan todos muy buenas tardes. Vos, Isabelle, que tengas muy buenas noches.
Yes, thank you. Good night. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Tschüss.
Buenas noches.
Bye.